What does our faith have to do with our bodies? For the Apostle Paul, the answer is everything. In our reading from 1 Corinthians, we caught Paul mid-argument, fiercely defending what he sees as the core, the non-negotiable part of the story of Jesus. That he died, he was buried, and that he was raised from the dead. And that because of this, we will too someday be raised. A physical, bodily, visible phenomenon that he lists the witnesses to as if he's in court just before the text we read. We read that one a couple of weeks ago. I know it's tempting to intellectualize or dismiss the resurrection as a relic of primitive religion, an archaic and antiquated belief that those gullible ancients latched onto. But you should know that no one in the ancient world believed in what Paul is describing, or almost no one. And these were people who believed that the entrails of birds could predict who would win a war, people who believed that portraits and charms of Medusa's head could ward away evil, people who thought that healing was secured through ritual baths and snake handling at the temple of Asclepius, but resurrection, nope, that is too far. The story of Jesus' resurrection was as hard to believe then as it is now, maybe even harder. The new believers in Corinth were mostly Greek pagans living in the Roman Empire. Their culture and traditions were certainly concerned about the afterlife, but for them, any life after death wasn't much of a life at all. They imagined disembodied, shade-like beings journeying through an underworld, or perhaps roaming through the earth as ghosts if they were not at peace. The relationship between the living and the dead was primarily about appeasement and remembrance, honoring your ancestors so they might not call curses down upon your head, providing them with what they needed for their underworldly journey, and using the deceased as kind of a good luck charm almost. There were dining rooms and annual feasts held in graveyards where people would celebrate with the spirits of the dead, leave food and gifts for them. Some tombs even had little pipes going down into them where you could pour wine directly into the grave to nourish the deceased in the underworld. I know some of you are thinking about requesting that now. But death and the dead were incredibly important parts of life in first century Greece. The location of the dead, their bodies and likenesses provided a kind of connecting point between the two realms. If you've seen the movie Coco, then you have a good idea of maybe what this kind of looked like. But the resurrection, the renewal and new life of the dead would have been nonsensical. It's just not on the table for your average Corinthian. There's no heavenly bliss to work your way toward, certainly no renewal of an actual life. The most people could hope for was some kind of disembodied peace, a release from the troubles that they faced in life on earth. Those people in power and the official religious and political structures of the Greco-Roman world promoted a belief in realized eschatology. Now, Lily knows what that is because she's in seminary, but we don't really need to go with all of those big theological words. But basically, it means you get what you deserve now in this life. This is what the powers wanted them to believe. If you are wealthy and powerful, it's because the gods have blessed you, right? And if you are poor or a slave or, God forbid, a woman, well, you're somehow getting what you deserve too. This system works really well for the rich and the privileged. It props up their status as God ordained, and it's a great way to keep everyone else in their place, right? Roman religion proclaimed, "Blessed are the rich, the full, the laughing, the well-liked, and woe to the poor, the hungry, the grieving, the reviled. You must have done something to anger the gods." Of course, this way of thinking is the exact opposite of what we hear Jesus say, right? So this is what Paul is up against, and I think This is why he gets so riled up in our text today. He's talking to people who are immersed in and depend on a belief system that devalues bodies, that separates body from soul. The body doesn't really matter. Eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. The soul is what continues to the afterlife. The body gets what it deserves, whether blessings or curses in this life, and the soul is just waiting for a release. Apparently, some of Paul's Corinthian converts could take or leave a hope of bodily resurrection, which was unnecessary, right? Irrelevant, impossible, according to their philosophical worldview. Paul is horrified by this, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he makes his most full and fierce argument for bodily resurrection, the first such argument in Christian history that we have access to anyway. For Paul, the resurrection is the central claim of the gospel. And of course, as new as this idea is to the pagan Corinthians, Paul doesn't come up with the idea of resurrection all on his own. He's a good Jew for whom body and soul are inseparable. And like many Jews of his day, he hoped for a final resurrection where the dead would be raised, all creation would be renewed, and God would reign and set things right. For Paul's strand of Judaism, resurrection was less about eternal heavenly bliss and more about justice. Many Jews looked around at an unjust world where people were oppressed and enslaved, nations were at war, innocent people were killed on the street, crucified. And they proclaimed, this cannot be the way that the world ends. Paul takes it even further than Pharisaic Judaism by saying, not only will there be a future resurrection of the dead by which God will renew all creation and set all things right, but that this has already started to happen. The bodily resurrection of Jesus has set this renewal in motion and guaranteed the truth of resurrection for us all, the first fruits. Paul is arguing himself in circles in our text today, not because he wants us to be right about a doctrinal proposition, no matter what your theology professor tells you. He's not trying to get us to understand perfectly the who, what, when, or how of the resurrection so that we'll be prepared for some theological test or be able to solve some kind of godly riddle. Paul insists on the bodily resurrection as a moral imperative that our bodies matter. And this spits in the face of Roman religion and culture, and our religion and culture for the most part, a culture that is fueled by the disposability of bodies, slaves' bodies, prisoners' bodies, women's bodies, the bodies of the poor and of the foreigner, and of anyone the powerful deemed to be an enemy of the state. In a culture like this, and a belief in bodily resurrection is a political threat. It means that death does not let the privileged and the powerful off the hook. They will be responsible to and for the oppression and injustice that they have created. And all of those who have been abused and enslaved and imprisoned will be made new and will be looking to God for justice too. By insisting on the reality of resurrection, Paul is making the same claim that Jesus makes in the Beatitudes, that the poor, the hungry, the looked down on people in our world are really the ones who are blessed, because God's kingdom, God's reign, belongs to them. Justice will be theirs, and those who are powerful, comfortable, well-fed, and happy had better be careful, because justice is coming for them too. I know these are maybe not the easiest texts to hear. They're not super easy to preach. For people in power, in both the first and the 21st centuries, resurrection is a threat. That's, I think, why the Corinthians would have liked to make that part of the story optional. This is why we spend so much time and effort intellectualizing and theologizing and philosophizing and symbologizing the resurrection today. If we can just think our way out of this primitive belief, the rest of Christianity sounds pretty good, right? The stuff about love, the stuff about community. But Paul says, no, that's not good enough. If that's all there is to it, he's a liar and a fake, and we are all wasting our time here. If that's all there is to it, then our faith does nothing but prop up the status quo. Now, what actually is resurrection and how does it work? I have no idea. And neither does Paul. If you keep reading in this chapter, you will see. He goes on to paint a poetic analogy about seeds blooming, the corruptible becoming incorruptible, but he's clearly searching here. He's feeling around in the dark. He's doing his best to make sense of it. Who knows? But whatever we think of resurrection, and just try not to strain your brain too hard here, Paul insists that our faith makes no sense at all unless our hope is embodied, that our future after death is somehow more bodily, not less, and this gives dignity to all bodily life that puts pressure on the systems in our culture that devalue bodies, whether they be systems in our culture that devalue black and brown bodies, whether they be systems in our churches that foster an environment where pastors and priests can abuse hundreds of children, whether they be systems in our own families that keep spouses in abusive relationships. The resurrection is countercultural. It's a threat to whatever the power system is because it proclaims the goodness and sacredness of bodies. Every body, black bodies, trans bodies, disabled bodies, female bodies, intersex bodies, abused and assaulted bodies, sacred. Our bodies matter, and the bodies of all those around us matter. Resurrection means that we do not get to be done with each other. We don't get to escape into disembodied bliss. We are responsible for and accountable to each other now and in the life to come. What does that mean for us? Probably a lot of things, but one thing that comes to mind for me today is that for people who look like me, resurrection means that we are not absolved from our ancestors' sins. The slate is not wiped clean with every death or new birth. We don't live and die in a vacuum, y'all. We are all in this together, all of us. All creation will be made new, all creation. And the idea that so many white people hold on to for dear life, that we are not responsible for things that happened before we were born or things that will happen after us, is a lie. Is a lie of Satan, y'all. I don't use that terminology very often. That's one reason that celebrating Black History Month is so important to us. We have to remember, we have to come to understand, we have to be willing to see our reflection in the light of Black history, as Minister Jordan told us last week. That's how we begin to join in God's work of repair, in God's work of redemption of our histories, of our relationships, of our own souls. The central story that we tell each other as Christians is that the God of creation put on human flesh, became embodied. That's how much bodies matter. God became one. And a brown body, I might add, a brown body that, like so many brown bodies in our world, was considered disposable by those with power and privilege. A brown body that was put to death by agents of the state, by his culture's justice system. And still, he rises. The story that we tell is a political threat, y'all. Get used to it. And it is the good news of God. What side of this news do we find ourselves on? How can we join in the gospel work of repair and redemption from wherever we are? May the God who loves each one of us so deeply guide us in this embodied work. Amen.